The folder slid across the glass table and stopped against my coffee. Anders Holm didn't look up. The reorg makes your role redundant, Solène. Effective Friday. 26 floors below, the city kept moving. Inside the boardroom of Veyrane Partners, no one breathed. These were the people I'd handed the firm's biggest accounts to for 9 years, and not one of them met my eyes. I read the page. Then I uncapped my pen and signed it. Anders smiled the way men smile when they think they've won something. He never once asked why those clients only ever called my cell phone. My name is Solène Vance, and for 9 years, I was the reason Veyrane Partners had a name worth printing on the door. We were a boutique strategy consultancy. 80 people on 2 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of firm that punched far above its weight because it didn't try to be everything. We advised mid-market companies through the ugliest years of their lives, restructurings, carve-outs, the bet-the-company decisions that bigger firms charged triple for and delivered with half the care. I ran the operations and transformation practice. On paper, that meant I was a principal. In reality, it meant I was the person clients called at 11 at night when a deal was about to die. I had built that book of business one dinner, one crisis, one kept promise at a time. There was Halloran Industrial, a family-owned manufacturer that had nearly gone under in my second year. Their CEO, a blunt woman named Eleni Andriadis, had fired 3 consultancies before me. I sat in her plant for 2 weeks before I said a single word in a boardroom. When I finally presented, she didn't hire Veyrane. She told me plainly, "I'm hiring you. The firm is incidental." I never forgot the phrasing. Neither, it turned out, did she. There was Brightmore Logistics. There was the Soares family's retail group. There was a fintech called Caldura that I'd carried from a Series B panic to a clean exit. Added up, and my accounts represented roughly 2/3 of Veyrane's annual revenue, a $63 million book that I serviced personally, because that was the entire point. People didn't sign with a logo. They signed with me. For most of those 9 years, that arrangement made me valuable. Then the firm hired Anders Holm, and value stopped being the metric that mattered. Anders arrived in the spring as our first ever chief operating officer, brought in by the founding partners to professionalize the platform ahead of a possible sale. He came from a firm 4 times our size, and he carried himself like a man who'd been sent to fix a charming little business that simply didn't understand how serious companies operated. He spoke in frameworks. He used the word scalable the way other people used punctuation. The first time we met, in the corner conference room with the view of the river, he flipped through a deck about me before I'd finished sitting down. "Solène, the Rainmaker." He said it without warmth. "You know what worries me about rainmakers? Tell me. Concentration risk." He tapped the page. 63 million in revenue tied to one person's Rolodex. If you get hit by a bus, the firm has a hole in its balance sheet. That's not a business. That's a hostage situation. I said the thing I'd say a dozen more times over the coming weeks. Those clients aren't tied to my Rolodex, Anders. They're tied to 9 years of trust. You can't institutionalize trust on a slide. He smiled like I'd proven his point for him. Everything can be institutionalized. That's what I'm here to do. I should have understood in that moment exactly what was coming. But I'd survived skeptical executives before. I'd outlasted reorganizations, ownership changes, 2 recessions. I assumed competence would protect me, the way it always had. That was the mistake. Competence had never protected me. The relationships had. I just hadn't yet learned the difference between the two. Over the next 2 months, Anders ran what he called a platform rationalization. He pulled my senior people into a centralized delivery pool so they could be staffed across the firm. He inserted account managers between me and my clients, bright, eager young analysts whose job I slowly realized was less to help me and more to learn my accounts well enough to one day replace me. He rerouted my client communications through a shared inbox for continuity and oversight. Eleni Andreatis called me about that one directly. On my cell, of course. "Solen, I got an email from someone named Trent asking me to use a portal," she said. "Who is Trent? I don't work with portals. I work with you. Is everything all right over there?" I stood at the window of my office, looking at the same river Anders had used to lecture me, and I chose my words carefully. "We're modernizing some processes, Eleni. Nothing that changes how I work with you." "Good," she said, "because the day that changes is the day I stop being a client." I told her not to worry. I told myself the same thing. I genuinely believed I was managing the situation. 3 days later, my assistant forwarded me a calendar invite I hadn't requested. Friday, 9 a.m., corner boardroom. Subject line, Organizational Realignment, SVANCE. The attendee list included Anders, both founding partners, and someone from an outside HR consultancy I'd never heard of. I read it twice. Then I sat down, opened a blank document, and started, quietly, for the first time in 9 years, to write down exactly which contracts had my signature on them and whose name each client had actually agreed to work with. Friday came the way bad news always does, on an ordinary, sunlit morning that had no idea what it was carrying. I wore the navy suit I'd worn to close the Caldura exit. Armor of a kind. At 8:58, I walked into the corner boardroom and found the chairs already arranged like a tribunal. Anders at the head, the 2 founding partners flanking him, and a woman from the outside HR firm with a folder squared precisely in front of her seat. The 4th chair, mine, faced all of them across the glass. "Solen," Anders said, "thank you for joining. Sit." I sat. He didn't waste time. As part of our platform rationalization, we've reevaluated the firm's senior structure. The market is moving toward institutional delivery models. Boutique, personality-driven consulting is, he searched for the word he'd clearly already chosen, a legacy risk. The reorg makes your role redundant. He slid the folder across the table. It stopped against my coffee cup. I looked at the 2 founders. Reed Castellani had hired me himself 9 years ago over a long lunch where he'd promised me Veyrane would never become one of those soulless machines. Now he studied the tabletop as if reading something fascinating in the grain of the glass. Beside him, Margot Soren, no relation to anyone, examined her own pen. "You're letting me go," I said. Not a question. I wanted to hear it land in the room. "We're streamlining," Anders corrected. "Your accounts transition to the centralized delivery team Monday. We've prepared a generous severance, contingent on a standard non-disparagement and a smooth handover. The relationships are firm assets, Solen. Verane's clients. We'll continue serving them at the high standard you helped establish." I almost laughed at helped. "And if I don't think those are the firm's relationships?" Anders leaned back, supremely comfortable. "Then you'll find that opinion doesn't survive contact with a contract. Everything you touched on company time, under company logo, billed on company invoices. That's not yours, that's ours. You're an employee, not an owner." He let the word employee sit there, deliberately small. I know that's a hard thing for a rainmaker's ego to hear, but this is just business mechanics, nothing personal. It is always nothing personal from the people for whom everything is. I felt the old heat rise, 9 years of late nights, of clients I'd talked off ledges, of a firm I'd carried, and I let it pass through me without showing on my face. Inside, something colder and clearer took its place. I started, quietly, to count. I thought about the Halloran Master Service Agreement, the one Eleni had insisted name me as engagement lead, by hand, in the margin. I thought about the Brightmoor renewal that was due to be re-signed in 11 days, unsigned, as of this morning. I thought about the Caldura retainer, which I'd structured personally, and which had a clause I'd written myself one tired Tuesday and no one had ever read since. Anders mistook my silence for defeat. So did the room. "I think that's everything," he said. "We'd like the handover started today." I read the page. It was exactly what he'd described, a generous number, a tight muzzle. I uncapped my pen, and because I needed Monday more than I needed a dramatic exit, I signed it. "Smart," Anders said softly, the way you'd praise a dog. I capped the pen, slid the folder back, and stood. Reed finally looked up. For half a second, something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe, or the dawning math of what they were doing. Then it was gone, and he looked back down. The walk back to my office took me past the open floor where my team sat. Word had already traveled the way it always does in glass buildings. Trent, the account manager Anders had wedged between me and my clients, was at his desk with 2 analysts. As I passed, I heard him say, not quite quietly enough, "Honestly, it's about time. You can't run a real firm on one person's dinner reservations." One of the analysts laughed. The other found something urgent on her screen. I didn't slow down. In my office, I closed the door, sat, and pulled up the document I'd started 3 days earlier, the quiet list of who owned what. Then I added a second column. Beside each client's name, I wrote down 2 things: the date their current agreement expired, and the personal cell number of the person who actually signed it. Halloran, Brightmoor, Caldura, Soares Retail. The list ran long. I looked at it for a long moment. $63 million, alphabetized. Then I picked up my phone, scrolled to a name near the top, and let my thumb hover over the call button. Let me pause here, my thumb still hovering over that call button, because I'm curious what you would have done in that boardroom. Would you have signed the page like I did and walked out calm? Or would you have made them say it to your face, in front of everyone? Tell me in the comments, sign or fight. I read everyone. And if you've ever watched someone underestimate exactly how much they needed you, consider subscribing. What happened over the next 48 hours is the reason I'm telling you this at all. I didn't call from my office. I called from the parking garage, leaning against my car on the dim 3rd level where the building's logic didn't reach. Eleni Andreadis picked up on the 2nd ring. "Selene, you never call before noon. What's wrong?" "They let me go this morning." A long silence. Then very quietly, "Who is they?" "A new COO. He's centralizing the client accounts, yours included. You'll be hearing from the delivery team on Monday." I heard her set something down, a cup, a pen, the whole pretense of a normal day. Let me make sure I understand. The firm I pay is removing the one person I agreed to work with and informing me on a Monday. That's the plan. "It is not my plan," she said. And then, because Eleni had spent 40 years building a company nobody handed her, "Send me your new number, the personal one. And tell me, when does my contract with Vereni come up?" I already knew the answer because I'd written it down 3 days ago in a quiet little document Anders didn't know existed. "Your master service agreement renews on the 1st. Auto-renew unless either party gives notice." "Then I'll be giving notice," she said. "Today." That was the first one. By the time I drove home, it was no longer the only one. Here is the thing Anders never understood, the thing that doesn't fit on a slide. A contract is a piece of paper. A relationship is a decision someone makes over and over for years, and it can be unmade in a single afternoon. When I'd signed Halloran, Eleni had taken a pen and written my name in the margin of the master agreement. Engagement lead, S. Vance. I'd thought it sweet at the time. I understood now that she'd been doing what she always did, making sure the thing she valued couldn't be quietly swapped out by a stranger. The same was true at Brightmoor, where the renewal clause named me by title, and the renewal itself was 11 days away and unsigned. And it was true, most of all, at Caldora. I remembered the night I'd written the Caldora retainer. It had been a Tuesday, late, the founder panicking through a near collapse, and I'd built the engagement structure myself because there was no one else awake to do it. I'd inserted a key person clause, a single paragraph stating that if the named lead consultant departed the firm, the client could terminate the engagement immediately without penalty and retain the work product. I'd written it to protect them, to reassure a frightened founder that they were buying my judgment, not a faceless firm. I'd forgotten it existed. No one at Verein had ever read it. It had sat in a signed PDF for 3 years like a seed under snow. That clause was now the most important paragraph in the building. By 8 that evening, I'd spoken to 6 clients. Not one of them said, "Let me think about it." They said versions of the same thing Eleni had said in a boardroom 9 years earlier. "I hired you. The firm was incidental. I didn't beg. I didn't badmouth Veirani. I'd signed a non-disparagement, and besides, I didn't need to. I simply told each of them the truth. I was no longer at the firm, and I would always be reachable at this number. What they did with that was their decision. They made it fast. Meanwhile, 26 floors up, the machine Anders trusted was beginning to tell him something was wrong. I learned the shape of his evening later, in pieces. At 5:40, the shared inbox Anders had been so proud of received a formal notice of non-renewal from Halloran Industrial. Auto-renew terminated, effective the 1st. At 6:15, Brightmoor's general counsel emailed to ask why the firm hadn't returned the renewal he'd been told to expect, and to mention that his CEO was reconsidering the relationship. At 6:50, an analyst on the delivery team, diligent, doomed Trent, opened the Caldora file to begin his smooth handover and read, for the first time in 3 years, a paragraph titled Key Personnel. I'm told he read it twice. Then he walked it down the hall to Anders's office and stood in the doorway, and the easy confidence that had carried Anders through Friday morning began, line by line, to drain out of his face. He didn't call me that night. Men like Anders don't call when the ground first shifts. They tell themselves it's a glitch, a misunderstanding, something a stern email can fix. He sent one to Eleni, to the portal, to Trent's address, copying a delivery lead she'd never met, assuring her of continuity of service under our enhanced model. She didn't reply to him. She forwarded it to me with 2 words on top. Continuity. Cute. By Friday midnight, 3 of Veirane's largest clients had put the firm on notice, a 4th was drafting, and the $63 million book Anders had called Concentration Risk was quietly walking out the door, toward a phone number that didn't ring at his building anymore. Somewhere on the 26th floor, the lights in his office stayed on very late. They called me back on Monday. Not Anders. Reed Castellani himself at 7:20 a.m. on my cell, the number he hadn't used in 2 years. His voice had lost all of Friday's careful distance. "Solène, can you come in? Please. There's a partner meeting at 9 and we need you in the room." "I don't work there anymore, Reed. You made that very clear on Friday." "Solène." A breath. "Please." I went. Partly because I'm not cruel, and partly because some endings are only worth having if you're there to watch them arrive. The corner boardroom was fuller than it had been 3 days earlier. Both founders. Anders, gray-faced, in the same chair he'd run the tribunal from. The firm's outside counsel, a careful man named Idris Okonkwo, with a stack of contracts in front of him. And this time, no chair waiting for me as a defendant. Reed actually stood when I came in. On the screen at the end of the room was a spreadsheet I recognized, because it was, line for line, the same list I'd written quietly in a document the week before. Client names, renewal dates, status. Except now half the rows had turned red. Anders spoke first, and the bluster came out before the fear could stop it. You did this. You poached our clients. That's a clear breach. You signed a non-disparagement. You signed a non-solicit. I signed a non-disparagement, I said. I've disparaged no one. Ask your lawyer. Every head turned to Idris. He didn't look up from the contracts. There is no non-solicitation clause, he said quietly. We discussed adding one in the severance. Mr. Holm declined to keep the package. He chose the word with visible distaste. Clean, and the master agreements? He tapped the stack. Name Ms. Vance personally as engagement lead at 3 of the 5 largest accounts. The Caldura retainer contains a key person clause permitting immediate termination on her departure. The Halloran agreement was on auto-renew. It is no longer. So fix it, Anders snapped. Repaper them. Send the delivery team. They don't want the delivery team, Reed said, and his voice cracked on it. Eleni Andreatis called me at 6 this morning, personally. She didn't ask for a discount or a new lead, she said, and I'm quoting her, I hired Solène. You fired Solène. There's nothing here to renegotiate. He looked at me, and 40 years of his own pride finally gave out. She's gone, Anders. Brightmore's gone. Caldura terminated under that clause an hour ago. Soris is drafting. The number landed in the room the way a body lands. That's $63 million, Margot Soren said, very softly, to no one. 2/3 of our revenue, in one weekend. I let the silence do its work. Anders rounded on me, and now the threat had curdled into something rawer. You think you've won? You walk into a market with nothing. No platform, no brand, no infrastructure. You're a freelancer with a phone. Those clients will come crawling back to a real firm in 6 months when you can't deliver. Maybe, I said. But that's not your problem anymore, Anders. Your problem is that you spent 2 months teaching the firm a lesson it didn't need, and the lesson cost it everything you were brought in to protect. I was hired to reduce concentration risk. You were hired because the founders wanted to sell this place, and a clean institutional platform sells for more than a personality-driven boutique. I watched that one land on Reed, who flinched. I read the same market you did, Anders. I just understood the part you couldn't. The concentration wasn't a bug in this firm. It was the firm. $63 million wasn't tied to a logo. It was tied to 9 years of people deciding, again and again, that they trusted me. You can't rationalize trust off a balance sheet. You can only break it. And you did it in a single Friday morning, for sport, in front of an audience, to make a point about who owned whom. Anders opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time since spring, the man had no framework. It was Reed who finished him. He turned to Idris. What does the partnership agreement say about removing an officer for cause? Idris finally allowed himself the ghost of something. 2/3 vote of the founding partners. 'Cause includes, I'm reading, material destruction of firm value through gross misjudgment. He set the page down. I'd call 63 million material. Margot didn't even wait for the formal motion. I vote yes. Yes, said Reed. That was the 2/3. Anders looked from one founder to the other, and the begging arrived at last, late and useless. Reed, you brought me in. We can fix this. Give me the weekend, give me the lawyers, I'll personally... Anders, Reed said gently, the way you'd speak to someone who has just understood they're no longer in the room they thought they were standing in. Go clear your office. Trent will walk you out. The same words, the same escort, aimed this time the other way. I stood, picked up my bag, and walked toward the door I'd been told to leave through 3 days before. This time, I left first. The market doesn't print a headline when a boutique consultancy loses 2/3 of its revenue. But the people who matter always hear Anders' home was gone by Monday afternoon. Escorted out by the same analyst he'd assigned to walk me out, carrying the same cardboard box he'd had ordered for my departure. The founders dressed it up internally as a leadership transition, but in a firm of 80 people on 2 floors, everyone knew. By the following week, the story had traveled the small, ruthless world of mid-market advisory. Rene brought in a fixer to professionalize, and the fixer professionalized himself right into a $63 million crater. In our industry, that is not a footnote. That is a tombstone. The sale the founders had been quietly courting, the real reason Anders existed, collapsed within the month. The acquirer's diligence team took one look at the revenue cliff and walked. You cannot sell a platform as institutional and durable the same quarter its largest clients leave for a single departed principal. The very project Anders had been hired to enable, he had personally made impossible. There's a clean, almost mathematical cruelty to that, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't appreciate it. I didn't gloat. I didn't have time to. By the end of that first week, I had a name on a lease and a name on a door, Vance Strategic, and a client roster that had, in effect, hired me before I'd opened. Eleni Andreadis signed first, on a single-page letter of intent, and wrote my name in the margin again, by hand, the way she had 9 years earlier. Brightmore followed. Caldura, freed by the clause I'd half-forgotten writing, signed the same day its Verane engagement terminated. The Soares family came over before I'd even finished hiring an assistant. 6 of my former senior team, the ones Anders had dropped into his centralized delivery pool to be staffed like interchangeable parts, called me within 10 days. Trent, to his small credit, was not among them. He was busy explaining to the founders why no one wanted continuity from the continuity team. I hired the 6. They'd built those relationships alongside me. They deserved to keep them. The non-disparagement I'd signed turned out to be the most useless paragraph in the building. I never had to say a word against Veran. The clients said everything for me, with their feet. Reed Castellani called me once more near the end of that first month. Not as an adversary, as a man cleaning up after a fire he'd helped set. "I should have stopped it in that room," he said, "on Friday. I saw your face and I knew, and I looked at the table instead. I've thought about that more than I'd like to admit. You wanted to sell, Reed. He told you trust could be turned into an asset on a slide. It was an easier thing to believe than the truth. What was the truth? That the asset was never the firm. It was the relationships. And relationships don't transfer in a reorg. They walk." He was quiet a long moment. "Will you take the firm's smaller accounts? The ones that stayed? I'd rather you have them than watch them drift." I told him I'd think about it. I did eventually take a few, not out of mercy, but because the people on those accounts had once treated me as a colleague rather than a line item, and that is a debt I pay when I can dot. As for Anders, I heard he resurfaced 6 months later at a larger firm in a quieter role, with the word transformation no longer in his title. I bear him no particular grudge. He simply believed the thing his entire career had taught him to believe, that people are functions, that loyalty is a vulnerability to be engineered away, that a relationship is just a contract with sentiment attached. He was wrong, and the cost of being that wrong was $63 million, but it was never really about the money. I think about that boardroom sometimes. The folder sliding across the glass. The word redundant. Trent's voice on the open floor. You can't run a real firm on one person's dinner reservations. He was right, in a way. You can't run a firm on dinner reservations. You can only run it on what happens at those dinners. The 9 years of small, unglamorous moments where a frightened CEO decides, one more time, that you are the person they trust with the worst week of their professional life. A year on, Vance Strategic is larger than the practice I left behind, and I sleep better than I have in a decade. Eleni and I had dinner last month. She raised her glass and said, "You know what the funny thing is? They were so worried about concentration risk, and then they removed the one thing keeping it from blowing up." I laughed, because she wasn't wrong. The risk was never that everything depended on one person. The risk was firing her.